The crocodile was lying across the ford before the first people arrived at the bank. It didn't move when they came, didn't slide into the water, just lay there, 4 meters of Nile crocodile spanning the width of the crossing, and the elder at the front of the group looked at it, and then looked at the river and said, "We do not cross today." Nobody argued. 6 hours later, the ford was under 3 meters of floodwater moving at 30 kilometers an hour. The Ruizi River in southwestern Uganda moves through a landscape that has been farmed and fished and lived alongside for centuries. The village of Kashinshero sits on its eastern bank, and the ford, a natural shallowing of the river where the bed rises close to the surface, has been the community's link to the fields on the western side for as long as the oldest residents can remember. Every morning people crossed it, women with loads balanced on their heads, men with tools for the day's work, children following paths their grandparents had worn into the bank. The crocodile was not unknown. Nile crocodiles lived in this section of the river. Everyone in the village knew them, knew their rough territories, knew the places where the river was safe and the places where it was not. The ford itself was shallow enough and wide enough to make it generally usable. The crocodiles were present but not reliably at the crossing. This morning was different in a specific way that the village elders noticed immediately. The crocodile was not positioned at the edge of the ford in the way a resting crocodile positions itself, on the bank above the waterline, or partly submerged at the margin. It was lying across the center of the shallows, its body spanning the crossing from one side to the other, its head toward the upstream direction. Solomon Tiburhanga had been farming these banks for 51 years. He had been crossing this ford since he was a boy. He understood the river the way people understand things they have lived beside their whole lives. Not as a fact but as a presence, with moods and patterns and a quality of attention that changed depending on what it was holding. He stood at the water's edge and looked at the crocodile. Then he looked at the river itself. It was slightly different. Not dramatically, the water level appeared the same, the sound of it appeared the same, the color at first seemed the same. But there was something in the upstream direction. A quality of the water's movement at the top of the ford. A slight urgency in the way it passed around the crocodile's body that he had not seen before. And something else. Upstream, at the edge of visibility where the river bent around the hill, the color of the water was not quite right. Pale brown where it should have been clear. He told the group behind him, "We wait." There were 14 people at the crossing that morning. Men and women who needed to reach the fields on the western bank, with the day's work ahead of them and no reason to delay. There were mutterings. Some of the younger men were skeptical. The crossing was there, the crocodile was a crocodile, and crocodiles were managed and understood and had been part of this river since before the village existed. Solomon pointed at the watercolor. He said nothing more. They waited. The crocodile did not move. It lay in the ford with its head pointed upstream, absolutely still, with the specific stillness of an animal that is not resting but attending. Its eyes, just above the waterline, were oriented toward the upstream bend. At 8:43 in the morning, 40 minutes after the group had arrived at the bank, the sound changed. Not dramatically, not a roar, not a rush. A deepening. A quality of the river's sound that Solomon had heard once before in his life, during the heavy rains of 1997, and that had taught him then what it meant. He turned to the group. Back from the bank. Now, high ground. This time no one muttered. They moved back from the bank and up the path that led to the higher ground above the ford. Solomon was the last to move. He stood for another moment, looking at the crocodile. The crocodile had not moved. It remained in the ford. He turned and walked up the path. The water arrived at 9:17. It came around the upstream bend as a wave, not a vertical wall but a surge, the river rising in seconds from ankle depth to thigh depth to something that had no depth in any navigable sense. A fast brown mass of water carrying trees and vegetation and the red soil of the upstream hills. The ford disappeared. The crossing point, visible 30 minutes earlier as smooth stones just below the surface, was simply gone, replaced by moving water 3 meters deep and still rising. The group stood on the high bank and watched. It lasted 4 hours at peak. The water moved through the ford area at a speed that no person could have survived in, the current visible in the way it pressed against the trees on the opposite bank, bending them downstream, the force of it evident and absolute. At 1:30 in the afternoon, the peak passed. By 3 o'clock the river was still high, but the character of the water had changed. The brown surge becoming more transparent, the velocity dropping, the sound returning to something closer to normal. By evening, the ford was visible again. Disrupted, the smooth stones shifted and covered with deposited silt, but present. The flood had its origin 40 kilometers upstream, in the highlands above the valley. A combination of heavy overnight rainfall in the catchment area and the partial failure of a small earthen dam used for agricultural water retention had released a volume of water into the upper Wizzy that the river could not carry at normal pace. The downstream movement had taken approximately 3 hours to reach the Cachanchero ford, 3 hours during which the hydrological signal of its coming had been moving through the river as a wave of changed pressure and water chemistry well ahead of the visible flood. A hydrologist from the Regional Water Authority who came to assess the event afterward spent time at the ford calculating flow rates and timing. She noted the sequence of events in her report. The rainfall event at 2 a.m., the dam failure at approximately 4 a.m., the flood front reaching the ford at 9:17 a.m. She also noted, in the report's observations section, what Solomon had told her about the morning. The crocodile had been in the ford since before 6 a.m., before the first villagers arrived. It had remained there through the morning and through the arrival of the flood. The hydrologist noted that Nile crocodiles were well documented as sensitive to pressure changes in moving water, capable of detecting upstream hydrological events through the lateral line sensory system that ran along their bodies, a system that detected low-frequency vibrations and pressure differentials in water with a sensitivity far beyond what human instruments could replicate at that distance and that low a pressure signature. The crocodile, lying in the ford at 6 in the morning, had been reading the river. When it had positioned itself across the crossing, the hydrologist wrote carefully, it had placed its body where it would block the ford while also orienting its sensory system, the lateral line, the jaw sensory organs, directly toward the upstream source of what it was detecting. Whether this constituted intentional warning behavior or territorial occupation or some third thing that did not fit existing behavioral categories, she declined to speculate in her official report. She was a hydrologist, not a herpetologist. But she noted the sequence. The sequence was documented. 14 people had been planning to cross that ford at roughly the time the flood arrived. The crossing would have taken between 7 and 12 minutes for the group to complete. The flood arrived with insufficient warning time for a group mid-crossing to have reached either bank safely. She left that calculation in the report without further comment. Solomon Tiburhanga, when the hydrologist asked him about his decision to turn the group back, was precise and unsentimental in his answer. He said, I looked at the river and I saw that the color was not right. I looked at the crocodile and I saw that it was facing upstream. A crocodile on this ford lies with its head toward the bank where it came from, or it lies in the water with its head downstream. It does not face upstream unless the river is giving it a reason to face upstream. He paused. He said, my father taught me that. The hydrologist wrote this down. She had been trained in quantitative hydrology and flood modeling and was careful about the distinction between observed data and traditional knowledge. She was also not inclined to dismiss a 51-year observation record from a man who had lived beside the same river his entire life. She asked him if this had happened before, the crocodile at the ford before a flood. He thought for a moment. He said, not in my lifetime. But my father described something like it. The crocodile does not always come. But when it does, the elders have always said, "Do not cross." She asked how old that tradition was. He said he did not know. It was older than anyone he had known. She included this in her report as an appendix, traditional ecological knowledge, she termed it, noting that the combination of behavioral animal cues and watercolor observation described by Solomon Tiburahanga was consistent with what a careful human observer would detect of an approaching hydrological event, given sufficient baseline knowledge of the river's normal state. She submitted her report. She did not expect it to change any policies. She submitted it because it was accurate. The ford was repaired over the following weeks. The silt cleared, the stones stabilized, the approach path on both banks restored. The crossing reopened. People crossed it every morning as they always had. Solomon was among them. He was not, by nature, a man who changed his routines because of single events. He had lived beside this river for 51 years and planned to live beside it for more. The river had floods sometimes. This had been one of them. Life continued. But he watched the crocodiles more carefully now than he had before. Not because he was afraid of them, he had never been afraid of them, not exactly. Because he understood something about the relationship between those animals and this river that he had known from his father but had not fully believed until the morning when the ford had disappeared beneath 3 meters of moving water while he stood safely above it on the high path. The crocodile had known before the instruments did, before the color changed visibly enough for most eyes to see it, before the sound changed. Before any human system, traditional or modern, had produced a warning. It had positioned itself across the crossing and waited. Solomon crossed the ford the next morning, as he had done for 51 years. The water was calm and clear. The smooth stones were back where they belonged, more or less. The far bank was the same distance away it had always been. He crossed. He went to his fields. He did not see the crocodile that morning. He looked. It was not visible. Somewhere in this river, which it had lived in for longer than any human being in the valley could remember, the crocodile was going about its day, doing what it did, reading a river that was older than everything around it. The morning was ordinary. The ford held.